The acrid bite of smoke, sharp and cruel, was the first intruder, a tangible entity clawing its way into Mark's nostrils the moment he slammed the car door, the sound echoing slightly too loud in the unnerving stillness of the late afternoon. It was a chilling premonition that twisted his gut into a cold knot. Then came the sound, a frantic, muffled banging from inside his father's small, usually peaceful house. A desperate rhythm against wood, and a voice, thin with terror, horribly frail. "Help somebody, please, I can't get out." His father, Arthur. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, lanced through Mark. He sprinted, his boots pounding the asphalt driveway, each impact a jolt, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird fighting for escape. The front door, a cheerful blue he'd painstakingly painted last spring, a color chosen by Arthur for its optimistic hue, was shut. He twisted the knob. Locked. Of course locked. He slammed his shoulder against it, a grunt of effort escaping him. It didn't budge, solid and unyielding. Then his eyes, scanning, frantically caught them. Heavy industrial chains, incongruous and menacing, against the cheerful blue, looped through the thick metal handles, secured with a gleaming, offensively new padlock. Fury, white-hot and immediate. A blinding surge of pure adrenaline coursed through him. What in God's name was this? A flicker of orange danced in the window pane to the left of the door, a hungry lick of flame reflecting the otherwise placid, late afternoon sun, distorting the familiar view of his father's living room into a hellish tableau. "Dad!" he roared, his voice cracking, pounding on the wood with both fists. "I'm here. I'll get you out." From the side of the house, near the meticulously pruned rose bushes, Arthur babied a figure emerged, walking with an air of officious self-importance that was almost a physical aura. Karen Miller. Her arms were crossed, a posture of immutable judgment, her lips pursed into a disapproving razor-thin line. A clipboard, her ever-present symbol of petty authority, was clutched in one hand, like a scepter, or perhaps a shield. She surveyed the scene, the smoke now visibly seeping from the roofline, not with the alarm any sane person would exhibit, but with a strange, unsettling satisfaction that made Mark's blood run cold. "There's a fire, Karen." Mark yelled, his voice raw with a desperate urgency that seemed to bounce off her impenetrable composure. "My father's trapped inside those chains." Karen sniffed a delicate, contemptuous sound. "Mr. Henderson has several outstanding HOA violations, Mark. It's all documented." She tapped the clipboard. "Unauthorized paint color on his mailbox, which he was warned about, repeatedly visible gardening tools, left out overnight, despite clear community guidelines, and now clearly an unpermitted burn on his property. The emergency access points are being secured as per community guidelines, Section 4, subsection B, until the situation is assessed by the board and the relevant authorities are satisfied no further risk is posed by his negligence." Mark stared incredulous, the world tilting slightly. The smoke was thicker now, a greasy black column pushing its way out from under the eaves with an audible sigh, carrying with it the scent of burning plastic and something sickeningly sweet. "Are you insane? He's going to die. Open this damn door." "I am simply upholding the bylaws." Karen stated, her voice devoid of any discernible human emotion, save for a rigid, almost fanatical adherence to her perceived authority. "Rules keep us safe. Perhaps this unfortunate incident will finally teach him to respect the rules that govern this community and ensure the safety and property values for everyone else." Thoria. The sheer, unadulterated callousness of her words struck Mark dumb for a split second, a moment of pure, disbelieving silence, where the only sound was the crackle of the growing fire and his own ragged breathing. Then, training years of it, a lifetime dedicated to fire prevention and response, kicked in with the force of a breaking dam. His mind went cold, analytical, a switch flipping. He whipped out his phone, his fingers already moving with practiced speed, dialing 911. "This is State Fire Marshal Mark Henderson." He said, his voice hard, now resonant with an ingrained authority Karen couldn't possibly comprehend, each word clipped and precise. "I have an active structure fire with confirmed civilian entrapment at 121 Willow Creek Lane, requesting full first alarm. Be advised, arson is suspected perpetrator is on scene and actively attempting to obstruct rescue efforts. Law enforcement presence required immediately." Karen's perfectly sculpted eyebrows, which always seemed to convey disapproval, shot up. State Fire Marshal. She scoffed, a disbelieving, condescending smirk playing on her lips. Don't be absurd, Mark. You install sprinkler systems for a living or something equally mundane. You can't possibly. Mark ignored her, his focus absolute. He could hear the distant wail of sirens, already a sound that was for him a comforting symphony of imminent action. He scanned the front of the house. The windows were old, single-pane, vulnerable. He spotted a large, decorative granite rock, part of his father's meticulously kept, Japanese-inspired flower bed. A bed Karen had cited only last week for non-native plant species and unapproved landscaping elements. With a primal roar of desperation and rage, fueled by fear and fury, he hefted the heavy stone and hurled it with all his might through the living room window. Glass shattered inwards with a satisfying explosive crash. "That's destruction of property," Karen shrieked, finally taking an involuntary step back, her composure cracking a flicker of something that might have been fear in her eyes. "You'll pay for that. That's a violation." "It's called rescue, you lunatic," Mark yelled back, already kicking away the jagged shards of glass, still clinging to the frame, his thick work boots offering some protection. He braced himself, preparing to climb in. The heat billowing out was intense, a physical blow. Through the smoke, he could hear his father coughing a series of weak, desperate gasps, fainter now. "Dad, stay low. Cover your mouth, I'm coming." Life in Willow Creek had for the most part been the quiet haven Arthur Henderson deserved after 3 grueling tours in dusty, dangerous places and a leg that never quite healed, right, a constant dull ache that was a souvenir of his service. His days were measured by the slow arc of the sun across his small, beloved garden, the friendly, unhurried waves of neighbors like old Mrs. Gable or the young Henderson family. No relation who lived 2 doors down, the weekly chess games, with old Mr. Peterson from across the street, a ritual of comfortable silences and shared memories. Mark visited every weekend, sometimes more often if his schedule allowed. He'd bring groceries, help with chores Arthur found increasingly difficult, like climbing the ladder to clear gutters, and they'd just share companionable silence on the porch swing, or Arthur would recount stories from his weak, simple tales of birds, spotted, or a particularly stubborn weed vanquished. Mark was a source of immense pride for Arthur, though the exact nature of his son's progression within the state's fire services was something Arthur only vaguely understood as important and making things safer for people. He knew Mark dealt with codes, complex investigations, and sometimes went to very big fires to help the local guys figure things out. He was a good boy, his Mark, reliable, strong. The Homeowners Association presided over with an iron fist in a velvet glove that had long since worn through to reveal the cold, unyielding metal beneath by Karen Miller, had become an increasing source of low-level persistent stress. Karen, who lived in the largest, most ostentatious house on the cul-de-sac, a 2-story beige monument to conformity, seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from wielding her power. Fines for grass, a 1/4 inch too long, meticulously measured with a special HOA-issued ruler. Notices about the precise shade of beige one's curtains had to be if visible from the street. Ecru is not beige. Mr. Henderson, it is ecru, and it is unacceptable. Directives on the number of decorative gnomes permitted per yard 0, as Arthur had discovered after receiving a sternly worded letter about the tacky and value-depreciating presence of a cheerful fishing gnome Mark had given him. Most residents grumbled quietly amongst themselves, but ultimately complied. It was simply easier than facing Karen's persistent, hectoring follow-ups, her unannounced compliance checks, and the threat of escalating fines and liens. Arthur, gentle by nature and averse to conflict, had tried his best, even asking Mark to repaint his perfectly good dark blue mailbox to the approved shade of oppressive muddy taupe. Mark had done so, biting back his irritation at the sheer pettiness, the waste of time and resources, the slow crushing of individuality. He'd seen bad HOAs before in his line of work, the kind that flagrantly neglected fire safety codes with overgrown brush or blocked crucial emergency access points with aggressive landscaping or illegally parked vehicles. But Karen's obsession was on a different level of personal intrusion, a micromanagement that bordered on the pathological. The first real significant confrontation, the one that had truly set Mark on edge, had occurred a month prior. Arthur, with great effort and painstaking care, had built a small raised vegetable patch in his backyard. It was a therapeutic activity highly recommended by his doctor for both physical and mental well-being, a way for him to connect with the earth and find a measure of peace. It wasn't even visible from the street, tucked away behind a tall row of lilac bushes. But Karen, during one of her infamous community perimeter inspections, which involved her peering over fences and sometimes even using binoculars from her upstairs window, had spotted it. A letter, crisp and official-looking, arrived the next day, delivered by certified mail. Unauthorized agricultural installations are strictly prohibited as per Covenant 7.3. Remove within 48 hours or face a daily fine of $50 retroactive to the date of discovery. Arthur had been visibly distraught. "But it's just a few tomatoes, Mark," he'd said, his voice trembling slightly, the letter shaking in his hand. "And some beans. It helps my back to stand, and Potter keeps my mind off things." Mark had felt a surge of protective anger, hot and fierce. He'd immediately called Karen. "Mrs. Miller, this is Mark Henderson, Arthur's son. We need to talk about this ridiculous notice concerning my father's vegetable garden." "Ah, yes, Mark." Karen's voice was crisp, cool, and utterly devoid of warmth or understanding. "Rules are rules. They apply to everyone equally. We can't have the neighborhood looking like a haphazard farm. It lowers property values for all of us. We have standards to maintain." "It's in his backyard, Karen, hidden from view. It's not hurting anyone. He's a disabled veteran, and it's good for him. His doctor recommended it. His disability status, while unfortunate, does not exempt him from the covenants he agreed to when purchasing his home in this fine community." She'd replied coolly, the implication clear that Arthur was somehow lucky to be there at all. "Perhaps a nice regulation-sized potted plant on the patio would be a more suitable and fully compliant hobby for your father. We have a list of approved flora if you'd like me to send it over." Mark had wanted to argue, to threaten to unleash the full weight of his frustration. But his father, sitting beside him looking pale and defeated, had pleaded with him to let it go. "It's all right, son. Please, I'll take it down. It's not worth the trouble, the aggravation." With a heavy heart filled with a potent sense of injustice and simmering resentment, Mark had dismantled the lovingly constructed raised beds the next day, his father watching silently from the porch. That was when he started quietly, methodically, looking into the Willow Creek HOA's founding documents, its convoluted bylaws, and Karen Miller's history on the board. A knot of deep unease tightened in his stomach. Something felt profoundly off, well beyond just petty vindictiveness or a lust for control. The sirens grew louder, closer, a chorus of urgent mechanical wails converging on their quiet street. Mark, now inside the acrid, smoke-filled living room, his eyes streaming, his lungs burning, located his father. Arthur was a huddled shape on the floor near the hallway, disoriented and gasping, trying to crawl away from the kitchen, where the flames now roared with an angry intensity. "Dad, I've got you." He scooped his father surprisingly light into his arms, a frail weight against his chest. Arthur coughed violently, a racking, painful sound, clinging to him with a desperate strength Mark hadn't known he still possessed. Mark carried him towards the jagged, gaping hole that had been the living room window, the roar of the approaching fire engine, a welcome, overwhelming symphony. As he carefully passed Arthur out through the opening to the first firefighter, a young, soot-streaked woman who scrambled through with professional urgency, he saw Karen. Her face was a mask of incredulous fury and disbelief, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering. She was being intercepted by a uniformed police officer who had arrived with the first engine. "This man assaulted me and destroyed private property." Karen was yelling, her voice shrill, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger at Mark, who was now helping guide the heavy hose line into the house, the brass nozzle cool in his grip. "He's a menace, arrest him." "Ma'am, please step back." The officer said, his voice firm, his stance unwavering. "The State Fire Marshal is handling this scene." Karen's jaw literally dropped. Her mouth opened and closed silently for a moment, like a fish out of water. "State Fire Marshal." Her eyes swiveled to Mark, who met her gaze, his own face grimed with soot and sweat, his eyes burning with a cold, contained fury. "Yes, Mrs. Miller." Mark said, his voice dangerously quiet as he stepped back out of the house, the initial adrenaline of the rescue giving way to a focused, steely rage. The firefighters were now advancing the line into the kitchen. "And you are under arrest for reckless endangerment, felony, unlawful imprisonment, and obstruction of a firefighter performing their duties. Officer, if you would be so kind as to cuff her." The officer didn't hesitate, clearly recognizing the authority in Mark's voice and demeanor. As the satisfying sharp click of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed in the smoke-filled air, other neighbors started to emerge from their homes, drawn by the cacophony of sirens shouting and the ominous glow of the fire. Their faces were a mixture of fear, confusion, and dawning comprehension. Old Mr. Peterson was there, leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes wide with shock. Young Mrs. Davies, the one Karen had relentlessly fined for her children's ephemeral sidewalk chalk, Art, stood with her hand clasped over her mouth, her children clinging to her legs. The fire, it was later determined by Mark's own investigative team, had indeed started from a faulty electrical socket in the kitchen, an old house's hidden gremlin exacerbated by some stored cleaning supplies. But Karen Miller's malicious actions had transformed a dangerous yet manageable situation into a potentially lethal one. Arthur, now on a stretcher being attended to by paramedics, oxygen mask strapped to his face, coughed weakly. "Mark, she locked me in, said it was for the messy yard, the violations." His voice was weak, threaded with disbelief and pain. "I know, Dad. It's over now," Mark said, gripping his father's hand tightly, his knuckles white. "She won't bother you or anyone else around here anymore. I promise you that." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity and revelation. Arthur was hospitalized for severe smoke inhalation and observation, but was expected to make a full recovery, his underlying resilience surprising the doctors. His house thankfully suffered only moderate damage, mostly contained to the kitchen and living room, a testament to the swift response of the fire crews Mark had summoned. The community, however, was in an absolute uproar. News of Karen Miller's arrest and the almost unbelievable revelation of Mark's true identity and position spread like wildfire through Willow Creek and then fueled by local news outlets to the wider county. The initial shock quickly gave way to an unprecedented outpouring of stories, a collective unburdening. It was as if a dam of suppressed resentment and fear had finally burst. At an impromptu gathering in the small neighborhood park a few days later, a space Karen had tried to regulate with rules about approved picnic blanket colors and decibel limits for children's play. People shared their Karen experiences, each story adding another layer to the portrait of a petty tyrant. "She fined me $500 because my wind chimes were, and I quote, not of a harmonious tonal quality, consistent with community aesthetic standards," one woman said, shaking her head in lingering disbelief. "She even sent me a list of approved chime manufacturers. She tried to get my golden retriever Barnaby taken away by animal control, claiming it barked excessively," added Mr. Henderson, no relation, his voice tight with anger. "Even though it was her wretched Siamese cat that was always sneaking into my yard and provoking him through the fence. She had video footage from a security camera aimed directly at my yard." Old Mr. Peterson, his voice quavering slightly but firm with indignation, spoke up. "She told me the small, unobtrusive ramp I'd installed for my late wife's wheelchair, even after Mary passed, was an eyesore and had to be removed immediately. Said it was a persistent visual blight on the streetscape. Mary loved sitting on that porch, watching the world go by. It was her only pleasure in those last months." He wiped an eye with a trembling hand. "I took it down. I didn't have the fight in me then. I regret that every day." Mark listened, his expression grim, his initial anger solidifying into a cold, methodical resolve. This wasn't just one power-mad individual exploiting her position. This was a systemic abuse enabled by an HOA structure that had clearly gone unchecked, fostering an environment where such behavior could flourish. He had already initiated a formal top-to-bottom investigation into the Willow Creek HOA's financials and practices through his office, utilizing the full extent of his statutory powers. What he was already beginning to find was deeply disturbing, painting a picture of graft and corruption that went far beyond lawn regulations. The HOA's bank accounts obtained via subpoena showed numerous highly questionable expenditures, large recurring consulting fees paid to a shell company Karen herself owned through a series of intermediaries, exorbitant costs for landscaping services provided by her unemployed cousin's barely solvent newly formed business, significant funds allocated for community improvement projects, a new fountain for the entrance upgraded street lighting that never materialized, the money simply vanishing into a labyrinth of poorly documented, untraceable transactions. The fines collected, and there were many extracted from residents for the most trivial of infractions, seemed to disappear into this financial black hole. Karen hadn't just been a neighborhood bully enforcing arbitrary rules. She'd been systematically treating the HOA as her personal fiefdom and private piggy bank. She had specifically targeted those least likely to fight back. The elderly like Mr. Peterson, the quiet ones, those easily intimidated by her aggressive demeanor and barrages of official-sounding letters. Arthur, with his visible disability, his gentle nature, and his desire to avoid confrontation, must have seemed like the perfect vulnerable target to further her control, and as Mark was beginning to suspect, perhaps even to try and force him out, devaluing his property with an endless stream of liens, so she or an associate could snap it up cheaply. The second shocking revelation, one that escalated the case beyond even Mark's initial suspicions, came during the discovery process for Karen's rapidly approaching criminal trial. Her newly hired expensive lawyer, attempting a rather desperate plea for leniency based on a supposed misunderstanding of her duties, inadvertently revealed Karen's long-term, calculated strategy. She had been systematically trying to drive down property values of specific desirable homes owned by long-term residents, including Arthur's prime corner lot, through a relentless campaign of harassment, manufactured violations, and the aggressive imposition of fines and liens. The goal was to make their lives so miserable, or their financial burdens so great, they would be forced to sell cheaply. She had a silent partner, a local property developer, with a notoriously shady reputation and deep pockets, who was ready to bulldoze the older, smaller homes and build oversized modern monstrosities that would irrevocably change the character of the neighborhood entirely, and from which Karen was set to receive a hefty, undisclosed kickback for each property acquired. The unapproved mailbox, paint the visible gardening tools the forbidden vegetable patch. They weren't just petty annoyances born of a control freak. They were calculated, deliberate steps in a larger, far more nefarious plan. Arthur's house, being on a desirable corner lot with mature trees, was particularly valuable for her redevelopment scheme. The fire, while accidental in its origin, had provided Karen with what she perceived as a golden, unmissable opportunity to escalate her campaign against Arthur, believing it would be the final straw to break him, or horrifyingly remove him from the picture altogether, under the guise of his own negligence and her enforcement of safety protocols. Her act of chaining the doors wasn't just panic or a bizarre adherence to twisted rules. It was a chillingly opportunistic move, a gamble she thought would pay off handsomely. The midpoint twist. The moment the tangled threads began to coalesce into a much larger, more sinister tapestry came during a deposition Mark gave to the district attorney's office regarding the obstruction and false imprisonment charges. He was detailing Karen's actions on the day of the fire, her precise words, her demeanor. One of the bright junior prosecutors, a woman named Sarah Chen, was diligently reviewing the thick volume of the HOA's convoluted bylaws Mark had provided, cross-referencing his testimony. Suddenly she paused, her brow furrowed. "Marshal Henderson," she said, tapping a page deep within the document. "There's a clause here, it's deeply buried in Appendix G subsection theta. It seems to grant the HOA president unilateral emergency powers in case of, and I quote, imminent community threat, including the right to secure properties to mitigate said threat. It's incredibly vague, dangerously so, likely unenforceable if properly challenged, but it looks like she might have actually believed she had some twisted legal standing for what she did with those chains. She manufactured the threat by ignoring the real one, the fire engulfing my father's house." Mark stated, his voice flat. "And her definition of securing was trapping a disabled man in a burning building." "Exactly," the prosecutor agreed, nodding. "It's outrageous. But what's more interesting, Marshal, is who drafted this particular amendment to the bylaws about 10 years ago." She pointed to a faded, almost illegible signature at the bottom of the page. After a moment of squinting, she read it out. "Councilman Robert Davies." Mark felt a chill colder than the fear he'd felt outside his father's burning house. Councilman Robert Davies was a prominent local politician, currently in the midst of a vigorous campaign for re-election, known for his tough-on-blight stance and his vociferous support for community revitalization, which often translated into lucrative contracts for a select group of property developers, including, as Mark now recalled with a jolt, the very same developer identified as Karen's silent partner. The web was wider, more insidious than he had dared to imagine. Karen wasn't just a rogue HOA president acting out of greed or a personality disorder. She was a pawn, or perhaps a willing and compensated lieutenant, in a larger, far more corrupt game of local development and political influence. The deliberately vague bylaw was likely designed to give cover for exactly this kind of strong-arm tactic against residents who stood in the way of profitable redevelopment schemes. Suddenly, the fight wasn't just about his father or the beleaguered residents of Willow Creek. It was about systemic corruption that reached into the heart of local government, poisoning the well of public trust. The climax, when all these simmering tensions and dark revelations would finally boil over, arrived not in a sterile courtroom, but at the hastily convened Willow Creek Community Town Hall. The meeting was ostensibly called to discuss the uncertain future of the HOA and to elect an interim board to manage essential services. The venue, the local elementary school auditorium, a place usually reserved for children's plays and PTA meetings, was packed to the rafters. Residents stood along the walls, spilling out into the hallways. News crews from several local stations smelling a story with wider implications than just a neighborhood dispute had set up their cameras and microphones at the back. Councilman Davies was present, predictably seated in the front row, looking impeccably smooth and exuding an air of concerned civic leadership, no doubt intending to manage the narrative and emerge as the community's savior. Karen Miller, out on bail, but looking pale-drawn and visibly diminished without her usual armor of self-importance, sat with her lawyer a few rows behind him, trying to appear inconspicuous. The interim HOA president, a nervous, perpetually flustered accountant named Mr. Henderson. No relation to Arthur, a fact that had caused some initial confusion, and then a ripple of wry amusement through the community, stammered his way through the opening remarks, his voice barely audible over the buzz of anticipation. Then Mark was invited to speak not just as Arthur Henderson's son, but in his official capacity as the State Fire Marshal. He stood at the simple wooden podium, calm and resolute, a stark contrast to the agitation around him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room fell silent as he began. He laid out the facts of the fire with dispassionate precision, the illegal imprisonment of his father, the clear and deliberate obstruction of emergency services, Karen Miller's chilling pronouncements at the scene. He then methodically detailed the financial irregularities within the HOA, the ghost contracts, the embezzled funds, the pattern of predatory fines, projecting damning bank statements, forged invoices, and highlighted sections of the HOA ledger onto a large screen set up beside him. A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd, growing with each new revelation. Karen Miller stared rigidly ahead, her face a stony mask, though a slight tremor in her hands was visible even from a distance. Mrs. Miller did not act alone in her mismanagement and abuse of power. Mark continued his gaze, sweeping deliberately across the auditorium, lingering for a significant moment on the increasingly uncomfortable Councilman Davies. She was enabled and perhaps even encouraged by a system of deliberately opaque bylaws and a profound lack of oversight. Bylaws, I might add, that were conveniently drafted to allow for precisely the kind of abuse of power we have all witnessed or personally experienced. He then presented with cold clarity the evidence of the systematic scheme to devalue properties, the undeniable connection to the developer, and crucially the conveniently worded bylaw amendment, projecting a magnified image of Councilman Davies' signature onto the screen. The murmur in the auditorium grew to a collective roar of outrage. People started shouting questions, accusations, their voices thick with anger and betrayal. Councilman Davies leaped to his feet, his face flushed, attempting to interrupt to seize control. Now, hold on just a minute. This is an outrageous slander. I will not stand here and be subjected to these baseless councilmen. Mark's voice cut through the din firm, clear and carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Are you denying that this is your signature on this official document? Are you denying your close and profitable association with the developer who stood to make millions from the forced sales and redevelopment in this very community at the expense of its long-term residents? He then projected a recent candid photograph of Davies and the developer arm in arm, beaming together at a lavish golf tournament fundraiser, a picture that spoke volumes. Davies blanched, visibly shaken, sputtering incoherently. The crowd, seeing his composure crack, turned on him with renewed fury, their anger palpable, a wave of condemnation washing over him. And Mrs. Miller? Mark said, his attention now laser-focused on her. She visibly flinched. Your actions on the day of the fire were not just a gross misjudgment or an overzealous application of deeply flawed rules. They were a conscious, deliberate decision to prioritize your corrupt agenda, your personal enrichment over a human life, over my father's life. He paused, letting the full weight of his words sink into the stunned silence that briefly fell. The district attorney's office, I can now confirm, is expanding its investigation to include charges of conspiracy wire fraud and racketeering in addition to the existing serious felony charges against you. And my office, the Office of the State Fire Marshal, will be recommending a full state-level audit of every HOA bylaw and every development project linked to Councilman Davis's tenure and his known developer associates across this entire county. The chaos in the auditorium was absolute. Karen Miller looked like she might genuinely faint. Her lawyer was frantically trying to speak to her to shield her from the glares and shouted imprecations. Councilman Davies, his face ashen, was being harangued mercilessly by a group of furious residents, his political career visibly imploding in real time. The uniformed police officers present at the meeting, initially there for crowd control, subtly moved closer to both Karen Miller and Councilman Davies, their presence a clear indication of the gravity of the situation. In the midst of it all, old Mr. Peterson, supported by his cane, but standing straighter than Mark had ever seen him, made his way slowly to one of the microphones set up for public comment. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly strong, carrying clearly through the auditorium, silencing the uproar. My wife, Mary. He said, his voice thick with emotion but steady. She deserved to sit on her porch with her ramp. She deserved that dignity. This isn't just about rules or money or property values. It's about decency. It's about our homes. It's about our lives. And it's about time we took them back. A wave of applause, heartfelt, spontaneous, and thunderous, swept through the room. It was the sound of a community battered and bruised, but not broken, finding its collective voice, its strength, its resolve. In the aftermath, the falling dominoes were swift and decisive, a cascade of consequences long overdue. Karen Miller, facing an overwhelming mountain of evidence and universal public condemnation, accepted a plea bargain that saw her serve significant jail time for false imprisonment and reckless endangerment. The subsequent financial charges led to further convictions and substantial orders for restitution. Her assets, including the oversized beige house that had been her fortress of tyranny, were seized to help cover the HOA's crippling debts and to compensate the many residents she had systematically defrauded over the years. She lost everything: her home, her reputation, her ill-gotten gains, and her freedom. Councilman Davies resigned in disgrace mere days after the explosive town hall, meeting his political career in ruins. The subsequent state investigation, spearheaded by Mark's office and the Attorney General, uncovered a sprawling network of similar schemes in other communities, a pattern of corruption involving developers, complicit officials, and manipulated HOA boards. This led to multiple arrests, indictments, and a significant much-needed shakeup in local governance across several counties. The developer Karen had partnered with found himself facing serious federal charges related to racketeering and fraud. The Willow Creek HOA was formally dissolved by a vote of its members and then painstakingly reformed under a new charter, one drafted with input from the entire community. It featured transparent processes, strict ethical guidelines, mandatory financial audits by independent firms, and crucially term limits for all board members. Mark, using the Willow Creek case as a powerful and galvanizing example, successfully lobbied state legislators for new comprehensive legislation, Arthur's Law, as it became informally and affectionately known among homeowner advocacy groups, that provided greater protection for homeowners against predatory HOA practices, mandated clearer emergency protocols for community associations, and established an independent ombudsman's office to handle disputes fairly and impartially. Arthur Henderson recovered fully, both physically and in spirit. His house was repaired, the community rallying around him with an outpouring of support and goodwill that deeply moved him. Neighbors he had previously only exchanged polite nods with brought over meals, helped clean the pervasive smoke damage, and in a particularly symbolic gesture, collectively replanted his garden. This time with a thriving, diverse vegetable patch that quickly became a small, vibrant symbol of their reclaimed freedom and shared resilience. Mr. Peterson, with the enthusiastic help of a team of volunteers, rebuilt a beautiful, accessible ramp leading to his front porch, wider and sturdier than before. The oppressive uniform tote mailboxes that had once defined Willow Creek began to disappear one by one, replaced by a vibrant, cheerful array of colors and styles, each a small act of joyful defiance. Mark often visited no longer just as a son checking in on his father, but as a respected friend and honorary member of the renewed community, one who had helped them reclaim their neighborhood and their dignity. He'd sit with Arthur in the newly vibrant garden, the scent of tomato plants and basil warm in the afternoon sun, watching the bees hum contentedly around the blossoms. "You know, son," Arthur said one sunny afternoon months later, looking out at the street, where children were now freely, exuberantly drawing colorful chalk masterpieces on the sidewalk, their laughter echoing through the clear air, a sound that had been conspicuously muted under Karen's reign. "I never thought much about those HOA rules before all this. Just tried to be agreeable, not to make waves. Figured it was easier." He shook his head, a wistful expression on his face. "Sometimes being agreeable isn't enough. Sometimes it just lets the bullies win. Sometimes you have to stand up not just for yourself, but for what's right for everyone." Mark smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "You taught me that, Dad, long before I was any kind of marshal. You taught me that by example every day." Dorito. The air in Willow Creek felt lighter, cleaner, the sunlight somehow brighter and more hopeful. The oppressive shadows of fear, petty tyranny, and corruption had receded, replaced by a resilient, vibrant spirit of unity and a hard-won, deeply cherished peace. The ordeal had been a crucible, a trial by fire in more ways than one, burning away the rot that had taken root in their community. And from those ashes, something stronger, more compassionate, and far more beautiful had begun to grow. The echoes of Karen Miller's cruelty and greed would eventually fade, but the memory of their collective stand, the courage they had found in each other, and the profound positive changes it brought, resonated powerfully, a lasting testament to the enduring strength of community and the quiet courage required to fight for it every single day.